So we're going to tell the story of Abraham bringing, not the whole story, but the first five verses of the chapter really spell out something that is just so monumental in my life. The response of Abraham in his trial, in his test. Verse 5 specifically. Oh man, stay here with the donkey. I'll translate. Use a kinder translation to not distract the children. He told his servant, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go up and we will worship. First time you see the word worship, depending on what Bible version you use. In the King James, that's the first instance of the word worship. So if we want to see what worship is, we might want to go back there. Amen? He said, we will go and worship, and then we will return to you. An amazing response. So we're going to unpack that momentarily. But I had an Abraham-Isaac moment. And I have an Isaac in this room. It's a female Isaac that I brought to the Lord to see if it was his will that I should marry this woman and spend the rest of my life with her. All the signs were there. All the confirmations were there. But I guess I got a little greedy, Becky, and I wanted something. I didn't need a star to fall from heaven. I forget what I even prayed, but it was something particular, a particular reaction that Brenda was to have that night that would let me know that this was God's will. I didn't speak it out loud because I didn't want the devil to interfere with that. And I forgot a little caveat that I'll tell you at the end that made me rethink it, because to my dismay that I did not receive that sign, or that was my understanding of it. And I had to go to this woman who I had become very fond of. You know, I started to miss her already. I felt like it was not God's will, because he didn't do the sign that I thought in the way that I thought that it should be given, and I don't even remember what it was now. And so I had to tell her that, you know what, I feel that this is not God's will. And it crushed her. She's Dr. Mouzon as a result of that, because she went on and started studying and moving on with her life and didn't want to be thinking about this guy. So she went and pursued a doctorate, and she's completed that. But I went home, I felt horrible. We're talking about getting things out of our pocket. And there was nothing wrong with our relationship, I felt. But I just wanted to be sure that it was God's will. And I didn't feel like I had that confirmation. So we broke up. It was horrible. And I can remember, if I told you before, I had in my first experience coming to God, my father asking me, was I happy? And I knew it was God speaking and not my father. I found myself going to my father to talk about this situation. I got that overwhelming feeling, once again, that this is God speaking to me through my father. And what I was praying was that I didn't want any more confirmation. While I was battling with, wow, this is not God's will. What am I going to do? I didn't want the nail in the coffin of my dad saying, well, you know, I really don't feel that Brenda is, you know, or something like that. I didn't want to hear that. So I was preparing myself for that. And he said, Brenda, I was like, oh, man, here we go. He said, you know what, you don't have to leave her or break up with her. He said, but you need to take this time to get yourself together first. I had been studying Satan's kingdom for so long, and there were so many firsts that I was about to face. I would be facing my first marriage and so many other firsts, and I had not thought about so many things when I was disconnecting from the world, and I had not given myself time enough to be able to transition, at least in the respect of a marriage. And that's what my dad was saying. But I kept remembering, echoing in my head, you don't have to let her go. Like, you don't have to let her go. And then it dawned on me, the caveat that I said, Lord, and if it's not your will, give her peace. And God did not give her peace. He didn't. I said, man, this woman doesn't listen to anything. I can't even break up with this woman. And I forgot about it. I'm like, what is going on, God? And it dawned on me when my dad said, you don't have to let her go. You just need to get yourself together first. And it clicked in my head, what about the peace that I asked God? That was a part of the sign too. And there definitely was not any peace. So then I said, okay, we'll go and do premarital counseling. After I came back, and she She was not thrilled, but we continued to talk. And I said, I told her what I just told you, that I forgot about that part about peace. But I had really literally given her up, just like we're about to see Abraham literally giving up his son. I had literally given her up, and God says, you know what, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that. And I have confirmation I chose the most difficult person who had the roughest reputation in terms of telling people bluntly that God has not, I don't feel that God has called you two together for marriage. I could have chosen a couple of other elders that they just would have gone through the motions and granted that request. But I specifically said, no, we're going to use Bill Winston. I had gotten a report about him that people that he advised, that he said, yes, I feel like God has called you into this to be married together. Those marriages were still successful, like 100%. And those ones where he did not feel that, they went on and got married with someone else, and then those marriages have failed. So I said, we're gonna go to counseling with Bill Winston. And when we got in counseling, all kind of stuff came out. Oh, cans of worms were opening up. And Brenda, like, I'm more reserved, but Brenda will tell everything. I'm like, Brenda, stop. You know? Like, no, don't tell him that. She told it all. I'm like, there's no way in the world this man is going to say that we were meant to be, that he feels God. I was like, so I was just waiting to hear it. In our last session, it was almost like he was speaking a foreign language because how bad I thought it was going when he said, the Lord has put you two together. And that was the confirmation that I asked God. And in the most difficult of situations where Brenda was doing everything wrong, I'm like, what are you trying to do here? You know, I was trying to help God out by hiding certain things. And she laid it all out there. I'm like, man, this man he's going to say we're incompatible and we need to get out of his office. But he said, God has put you two together. He said it's going to be an adventure, but God has put you two together. And there's been many more confirmations on that. But we're in Genesis chapter 22. I want you to think about the things in your pocket, things in your life, things that you yet have to give up or things that you have given up, and God has given you that peace, the peace that surpasses all understanding. Genesis 22, verse 1 says, and it came to pass after these things. After what things? Oh, man, he had been through so much. He had rescued his nephew Lot from these kings. There was this territorial war that was going on. His nephew was taken as a spoil. Abraham had gone in and gotten his son out. Abraham and some of his men, his nephew. And then he refused the rewards. He said, you know, I don't want anyone to think, and that's how I feel. I don't want anyone to think that you bless me. I want everyone to know that all my blessings come from God. So he turned down the riches. He turned down the spoils when he helped those kings. And what about the failures that he had, the tests, when he lied and said this is his sister and all these things. So those are the things after these things that God did. I'm going to put the word test here because God does not tempt us. But God did test Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, behold, here I am. And he said, take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac. And you should be hearing in this message the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, that's where she got her name from, and offer him therefore a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his donkey, took two of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went into the place of which God had told him. Then on the third day, this was like 50 miles away, and they didn't have Uber, they didn't have trains, they had to walk. And this man, this is a silent walk, because you know what's on his heart. Not much talking, it's quiet. You can see how dreary this would be. Put yourself in these shoes, and you probably have been in them. Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his donkey, took two of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went into the place of which God had told him. Then on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. This is what I want you to pay attention to. Look at this response. Think about your response. Well, when God has tested you or you're in a trial, I pray that we will be so faithful, that we will have enough of the Holy Spirit and enough experience with God for something like this to kind of just fall off our lips without us even realizing the depth of what we're saying. And Abraham said to his young men, abide ye here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go yonder and what? We're going to worship. And we will come again or return unto you. Now, he was going up there to sacrifice him. He said, but we'll be back. Some kind of way he just knew that they would be back. He knew that God had called him. This man was 90-some years old. He finally had gotten this son. At about 100 years old, he finally got this son. He raises him to this point, and now God is saying, do away with him? Didn't make sense. But he was obedient. It says he immediately rose up and went and did this. Didn't even talk to his wife about it because he didn't want her talking him out of it. He knew it was the voice of God. Just like I knew it was the voice of God, or I thought it was the voice of God saying, no, this is not the way. And then, to my surprise, figuring out, yes, this is the way. When I was willing to give her up. It's only when you're willing to give up these things that mean so much to you that sometimes God can say, okay, now I can trust you with it. So here Abraham is, and you get a lot of lessons from verse 5 alone. One of them is separation. Thank you. Thank you, my child, Mariah. One of them is the separation. Sometimes your closeness to God will bring you separation with others. You notice in verse 5, there's a certain point. They're journeying. You know, you have the donkeys carrying the things that you need. But there's a certain time where he says, look, okay, now it's just going to be my son and me. You stay here. So that's a separation. Sometimes people are not going to understand where you are, where God is calling you to walk. And there's only a certain point. They'll walk with you to a certain point, but you get to this point where you look crazy or out of your mind. And there's a situation where you find yourself alone, but you're never alone. There's one who is watching, and you're never alone. He is there. So he said, look, we're going to go up. This is personal. It's just going to be me and my son, and then we're going to go and worship. And now in this age of the worship wars and my worship style and your worship style, they didn't have any worship style. The only one who deserves to have a worship style is the object of worship, which is God. So you had the young and old on one mountain worshiping. There wasn't a youth mountain. There was no separation. These people were worshiping together, both young and old. And that's how it should be in the house of God. Not knocking children's ministry, but children should be able to worship with their parents. God is just as much God to us as he is to them. And just as much God to them as he is to us. And he said unto his young men, abide ye here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again unto you. And worship, without reading the rest of it, is just simply trusting obedience. That's what worship is. It isn't in a certain key. It isn't with a certain pitch or with the instruments. You're the instrument, and God is watching you. And he's watching your trusting obedience. Not just obedience, because you could obey for fear of hell or jail or for fear or to gain a prize or a reward. But when you're trustingly obeying him, when you trust his word, when you look at his track record, when you look at his character and you can't help but to trust what he says and say, not my will, but thy will be done, that's when he can trust you. The title of the message is Blessed Assurance. And I'm not only thinking of the blessed assurance that we have in Jesus Christ. The blessed assurance that Abraham must have had to say, you know what? This doesn't make sense for this boy to die. He's going to raise him back up again after this. That's what Hebrews 11 said. That's what was going on in Abraham's mind. He said, I'm going to do this. But God is able to raise him back up because the promise has to be fulfilled in Isaac. He knew it. And the promise has to be fulfilled in your life as well. Don't throw your dream away. Don't throw your plan away or God's plan for your life. He's purposed it. He's spoken it. And like we said this morning, it's already an attested fact. It's already there. It's already the things that he speaks. It's like history, like Chuck was saying. And so he knew that God was able to raise him up. And we have to know that as well. We have to know that God can carry us. He can bring us through. But not only the blessed assurance that we get for trusting his character, but the blessed assurance that God has in us. Before God called him, he said, wow, I know him. He said about Abraham, I know him, that he will give his family charge to obey me and keep my statutes. He said, I know Abraham. He didn't have a family at that time. He said he's going to raise his children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. How many children did he have when God said that? 0. Didn't have any children, but God said, I know him. And if you look at him, when he see Abraham with that dagger and his willing son who could have gotten away from his older father, he could have gotten away. He could have talked his way out of it, or even just physically prevented his father from doing it at that point, laying willingly on that altar and participating with that sacrifice. And praise God, the angel says, no, don't do it. Don't do it. Speaking on behalf of God, he says, okay, I put you through this test, and now I know that I can trust you. Seeing that you have not withheld Brenda you've not withheld that thing you love, whatever it is. You were willing to give it up. You were willing to give her up, willing to give him up. Now I know I can trust you. God has the assurance. He's looking for the assurance in us as well. Those who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus Christ. Not just possessing his faith, but he can have faith in us because we've allowed him to transform us. I'm so thankful that I had a happy ending to my story. Some of you may still be in the waiting period. So many things we depend on God for, and we want them when? We want them now. We have that microwave mentality. When things don't happen, we want to be able to do it at a press of a button. We want God to figure out our comfort level and always keep us comfortable. But he doesn't always do that. Doesn't mean that he isn't watching or that he doesn't care. And we can rest in the assurance that his purpose will be fulfilled in us. He's called us as individuals and as a church, and that's what we're celebrating today. Our call that gets us out of ourselves. I love the quote Ellen White says, self will be forgotten in earnest work to do others good. But before we can help to save some others, we have to be saved ourselves. This is our time to acknowledge our sinfulness, our need of him, our need of Jesus Christ, the recreator, not only the creator, but the recreator, not only of the universe, of the new heaven and earth, but also a new heart in us. How many of us want and have that new heart? It's an awesome thing, something to celebrate. And as we take part in the emblems, before we partake in the more glorious aspects, he gives us the ordinance of humility to break us down, like he was broken down. Jesus has been coming down. You know that he was in glory, in a high place, angels bowing before him. And he chose to come down to earth. That's a long drop down. And not only that, he took on the form of a servant, even though he was in the very form of God. He chose to be a servant. That's a nice word for a slave. And he's called us into service. That's a nice word for slaves. We're free from the power of bondage and sin, but we're a slave to Jesus Christ. And what a wonderful master he is. That's what we celebrate today. So before we depart and break up into groups for our foot washing, just humble your hearts. Be open to God's leading. What may be in your pockets, as Becky had so aptly stated? What may be in your life? What things might we need to get rid of? What ideas might we need to get rid of? What things may we need to take on to be able to have that blessed assurance that we are in God's calling and in his order?